we're more likely to be happy if we have clarity on our values and bring them to life in a daily and weekly basis, in big and small ways. And sometimes I wish I could just infuse in everyone working for someone the fact that they could be fired anytime. Not in a now turning to extreme pessimistic perspective, but just keeping it on the list of things that could happen, having it on the range. Because again, it's as if we have this positive bias thinking that whatever I'm doing right now, I will keep doing until I decide to stop doing it. A lot of people will say, oh, I don't have time to think about all this. Seriously, you could say, I'm going to sit down for 15 minutes and you're already going to have more clarity on what's actually going on. It just requires you paying attention a little bit, increasing your self-awareness, and often writing it down and following the prompts that I have in the book.
You are listening to My Rejection Story, hosted by Alice Draper. Welcome back to another episode of My Rejection Story. Today, I am joined by Dr. Pelletier, also known as MH, which is a handy reference for mental health, so the short form's great. She wrote a wonderful book called The Resilience Plan, a psychological approach to preventing burnout and optimizing performance. And the first thing that really caught my eye in the book was the supply-demand framework, which implies, I guess, and maybe you can define what the supply-demand framework is, but what I got about it is that resilience is not something that's just innate within us. We kind of have to operate between how much we're giving and how much supply we have. So could you define the supply-demand framework?
Yes, and it's such an important piece. It is one of the parts of the framework that I've heard the most feedback about, that people have found so helpful as well. And this made its way in the book because often people, all of us, includes me as well, we tend to underestimate the demands we're facing. So if I ask someone how many, what kinds of demands are you facing, they'll name 2 or 3 and leave it at that. And then we overestimate how much supply we have, what brings us energy. Oh yeah, I have this, I have that, da da da. And then I say, oh, how about when's the last time you had this? And then people will say, oh, well, the past 3 months have been incredibly busy, so no, but in general. So really what this means is we're underestimating the demands, overestimating the supply. So our read on our context is actually not accurate. And if we're starting from this, we're not really looking at the data, right? The reality of our context. And that means we're not going to think we need to take any action about our resilience. And to your other point, no, it's not a personality trait. It is something we can build.
So how do we get better data if we have this blind spot or bias towards this, how much supply we have and what the demands are? How can we get a better read on that?
Exactly. Well, simple as I have worksheets that go with the book that we can share with everyone in the show notes if we want. They are fairly, they can be used on their own. They don't need to be used with the book, but that's part of the simple reflection. It actually does not take a lot of time. I know a lot of people will say, oh, I don't have time to think about all this. Seriously, you could say, I'm going to sit down for 15 minutes and you're already going to have more clarity on what's actually going on. It just requires you paying attention a little bit, increasing your self-awareness, and often writing it down and following the prompts that I have in the book. But in a nutshell, it does have to do with saying, don't just stop at the 1 or 2 demands you think you have at work, for example. Yes, these are on the list, but then put also the demands you have in your personal life. Okay, again, people will usually put 1 or 2, and then go back, all the other demands at work and all the other demands in your personal life. And not just the demands you wish you did not have, but also the positive ones. So you just got a big new client that you've been wanting to work with. That's great, very exciting, positive. And a demand. Or in personal life, planning an exciting trip somewhere. Fabulous. You've been wanting to do this. It's wonderful. And a demand. So then we start having a much more realistic view, better data on all the demands we have.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is get a pen and paper out and start writing it down.
That's right.
What if we write it down, but we still don't really grab how much it's going to take? So I think Personally, I have sometimes overestimated how demanding some things are going to be. So I'd be like, okay, I have this many clients, I can't do anything else. And then maybe it's just because I'm an overachiever, but then I'd be like, I could have done more like during this time. Like even going back to my university days, I didn't know how much my degree was going to take in when I majored, and then I regretted not doing like a third major because I was like, oh, I had like all this free time. So how do we like, yes, we can externalize it, but how do we get a read, especially if it's maybe a new project or we don't really know like how much it's going to take from us?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, most of the time, a lot of the time, people, what gets people in a problematic zone is thinking things will take less time, and therefore they pile on too much, say yes to too many things, and that kind of thing. But what you're describing is also an important piece. And it is connected. It just goes in a different direction. Sometimes I say it's put the hat of a project manager on. And if we've worked with project managers, it's such a lucky thing. Maybe you have, and people listening to us have. If you haven't, I'll tell you in a nutshell how it feels. Initially, if you want to get so many things done, the project manager will often actually tone it right down, because they're going to say, wait a second, this is your project number one. And now they're going to have like a million steps in this project. You thought there were like 3 things that needed to get done to do the project. They will break it down in a million steps, not a million, but many. And then they will actually estimate each of the steps realistically with a buffer. What if this thing doesn't work, all the things that we don't think about, don't want to think about, don't think exist even. And all of this leads to a much more realistic view. Once they've done their project plan and you look at it, even if you maybe didn't like it initially, like the idea of having this level of detail and these levels of realistic information about how long it's going to take, but it forces you to see it. Now, the same way this might bring a realistic perspective to someone who was underestimating it, it would also bring a more realistic perspective if we are overestimating it, realizing that maybe we've thought that this was going to take, I'll just use a number, 10 hours. Now that we break it down, even with buffers, it would be very exceptional if it took more than 6 hours. So then that becomes your decision, your sort of risk, comfort, and that kind of thing, to say, you know what, my estimate of 10 was too far on the conservative side, 6 may be more realistic, and then you go for it, which again brings us to either pen to paper or good old Excel spreadsheet to clarify what the realistic parts are.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing is really take that time. And I think, put that project manager hats on. We could probably use past data to make some more detailed assessments based on similar projects that we've been involved in. Yeah,
you can use past data, and then one of the key things that sometimes is a trap is to use past data and just plug it in now, kind of thing. Depends how old, how past are we talking about. If it's last week, potentially it's similar. But even then, part of what makes us able to handle all these demands now is the context we're in now. Like something else may have come up even since last week, right? Something else changed in your health or the health of someone around you, or another demand came in, which means what was taking 4 hours last week would actually take 8 this week, because half of our time needs to be focused on something else. Just switching tasks means it takes longer to find our focus again, if, say, we're writing a book, for example. And so we need to take context into account. Yes, past data can be useful. See if it needs to be adjusted based on the new context.
Yeah. Thank you. See if it needs to be adjusted, and probably also like keep some buffer, because you said, as
Yes.
you said, like some things might come in and I don't know, your mom gets sick or something, and now you've gone and over prioritized everything else and there is nothing left for the unexpected.
That's right.
H or Dr. Pelletier,
Right.
I would love for the audience to learn a little bit more about you and your background, that you have a PhD and an MBA. Your first language is French.
That's right.
You've written a book called The Resilience Plan, where you translate psychology research into strategies that anyone else or any reader can use to thrive professionally and I think personally too. What else should listeners know, and how did you get here? How did you become someone that wrote a book called The Resilience Plan?
Well, I got there in general, often by just following my nose. What felt interesting to me, and then exploring this further and going for it. That's in general just how the various, in my case, the psychology combined with the business. And I can tell you more about how exactly that happened. But it was literally following, oh, I'm having this experience. This means we need to know more about this. Okay, I'm going to do research in this area. Now that I've done research in this area, it sort of went like that. And the book specifically about resilience came because it came out of conversations with my coaching clients, conversations with the audiences I was working with and continue to work with. And specifically, a lot of people, and especially with COVID and everything, heard a lot about the kinds of things that would increase our resilience, which we need for so many things in life, including dealing with rejection. And so people know the kinds of things that probably would help, and they want it. At the same time, they're having a hard time finding a way to land it in their lives. Just too busy, don't know what to do, where to put my energy, all of this. And therefore, they do nothing about it. Also, in part because they think it's personality, which it's not. And so the book brings together, yes, what we know from psychology, but the importance of actually taking our context into account, which is the strategic part, so that we can actually have a plan that will work for each of us. Yes, it's research informed, but Alice's plan versus MH's plan today will be different. And our plan from today compared to, say, 3 months from now will be also different because our context may change. So that's the idea, bringing psychology and strategy together so that we can actually get to a plan that works.
Yeah, I think it's such a valuable thing that you've done in terms of bringing psychology and strategy together. And as you just touched on now, you know that a lot of people think that it's innate or it's within your personality, whether or not you're resilient. I know and assume that many of my listeners think that too. And so a lot of people listening struggle with rejection sensitivity. And so that term resilience can be rejection resilience too, which is like, how resilient are you to all the no's that are going to arrive when you are ambitious and you want to go after big goals? And some people believe that they are innately less resilient and therefore that they can't go become an author or a successful entrepreneur or whatever it is because they just don't have a thick enough skin to get through it. And that's innately part of some people's characteristics and not part of others. So what are your thoughts on that? Just that kind of idea that some people have a thick skin and some don't.
Yes. Well, so there's a few parts to this that are important in what you're saying. So one of the things we know from research actually is that there are some personality traits that tend to be associated with higher resilience and would help with dealing with rejection, like optimism. So a tendency to find the positive in something. That helps. But that's it. And even if we have this, it's not a guarantee that we're always going to be resilient. Even then, we need to build it. And so I think sometimes the notion that it's who we are, I think it's a bit of combination of just how people talk in general, how sometimes it makes it easier for all of us to assume it is part of a personality. So a trait we either have, a trait we don't. Sometimes it's even, we've heard it. Sometimes people will tell you or tell other people, oh, you're the rock. You can hold the stability for the team, for the family, for the group of friends, all that kind of thing, as if it was a personality trait. And so you hear this and you start thinking maybe it is. So that's how we get there. But the reality is that no. It's, if we think of resilience as our ability to go through adversity or demands and come out even stronger, and here that would include rejection moments, then there are things we can do proactively and even reactively during that will help us change our experience of this moment and allow us to grow, to learn something from it that we can take with us in the future, which then transforms this experience from something that was difficult and hurtful, which still was in part, to something that then allows us to grow and carry on and become even our better selves.
This is so interesting. I mean, so especially that optimism is the one personality trait that's helpful. I think that's really interesting. Can we cultivate optimism? Like, is that even an innate personality trait or is that something that we can work on?
We can work on any personality trait are things that we can work on. We'll move within a range. We usually will not become the complete opposite to what we naturally are. They tend to be a bit stable over time, but they can also move a bit over time. So yes, we can cultivate this. And a lot of this has to do a bit with how we're thinking about various situations, right? If we're going through, say, a situation of rejection, and I've had some of those, we've had some of those as well. Sometimes there will be initial thoughts that will either tie the rejection to our whole identity. Well, this is who I am, and if I'm rejected here, I'm nothing. Or I will always be rejected like this. Or this rejection will lead to terrible, catastrophic consequences in the future. These are normal human reactions to have. It's not a problem in itself, but what we want is to catch these, to realize we're having these thoughts so we can just expand the perspective. Is it possible I'll have other rejections? Yes. Is it for sure not that I will have only rejections moving forward? Or is it for sure changing who I am? Okay, maybe not as much as I was thinking. And so all we're doing is making sure we have a broad perspective on this particular situation, not just a slice of it that we then blow up to being the entire situation, which makes it even more painful, more than we need to, really.
Yeah. Having that broad perspective, I think, is really helpful. And I feel like a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy is around kind of helping us gather, in terms of reframing, is gathering more data and looking at it from a different perspective. So earlier, just now, when you were talking about like optimism and then kind of building up that rejection, or just building up that resilience towards bad feedback or any kind of no's that come up. Yeah. So I think as you're touching on optimism and that some people are born. It sounds like some people are born a little bit more optimistic than others. Does that mean that some people are born more pessimistic than others? Okay. That's
Yeah.
really interesting. I didn't
Yeah, it's a
realize that.
combination of nature and nurture, but that then shapes our personality, how the lens we tend to use in various situations. Again, we can modify these lens, we can broaden the lens, but yes, we'll have natural tendencies.
So interesting. Okay. And would that make it a little bit harder so if a listener is listening and they think like maybe they, as you were just discussing, innately struggle a little bit more with, I guess, being optimistic or seeing this rejection as an opportunity, and one door closing when there's many, many more doors opening, maybe they just see the one door closing and that be kind of deterministic, and they suspect that that's more part of them, that they maybe have a more pessimistic mindset. If they're listening and they feel a little bit less hopeful, I guess what message would you have for people who kind of feel like they fall more on that end of the spectrum?
Well, so there are actually good news with this, because if in general people tend to have a bit more of an optimistic bias, like we assume things will go well. I'm not talking about the very optimistic people who seem to always think everything's great. It's almost too much sometimes. It feels right, toxic optimism almost. But in general, we go about our lives not thinking about all the possible risks of anything. We do maybe sometimes, but not all the time. So and one of the professions that we know from research tend to be a bit less optimistic, more pessimistic, are lawyers, because they are trained to look at the risks, right? That's part of what they do for work. So if in general you're noticing that you tend to have a bit more of a pessimistic perspective, it has advantages. That means let's say you're a book author, you're writing, you're thinking already of the high possibility that you will go to many doors that will say no response, not even acknowledging the email, just about this. Now, part of what we want is to make sure we pair this with a realistic perspective, that it's not because there is a high probability of this that it is 100%. We still want to try. It's normal. That's what happens to most authors. Some very lucky authors, no, but most of us, yes, that's the way it is. And so what we can do is prepare for this. Prepare for when the no comes in, how do we then respond? Planning in advance, like before you even read the email back, or 3 days later, no response. Am I going to let myself slide into the nothing's ever going to work? Or will I go with this is one response or one absence of response, which means is a no. And my job is to keep going. This is a numbers game. I'm going to keep going. So if you think of it in advance, when you read the email that says, we've received lots and we don't have time for you, then you manage your brain very consciously and say, okay, that's one of those other instances of no. I'm keeping going with all the others. And so preparing yourself a bit in advance, it can help. But in itself, not entirely bad, because you'll also have many authors who are going with the optimistic bias that people will respond to all of their outreaches, that a number of them will be very interested and that they'll have options.
Yeah. So as you're talking, I'm just thinking that like we need both. We need that kind of the negativity part being like also like a little bit of realism.
That's
I
right.
would maybe
Yes.
frame it as like optimistic realism. Like, okay,
right.
you know that you're going to struggle and there's going to be a lot of rejection or a lot of no's in this big goal, whether it's writing a book or becoming the next CEO in your company or becoming a very successful entrepreneur. You know, if you're going in with a very realistic understanding that there's going to be a lot of doors closed in front of you, but then also optimistic enough to keep going. And I think that striking that, at least in my experience personally, is hard. It's hard to kind of strike that balance of being enough to keep going, but also realistic enough to know. Because I think as you're touching on, you know, that the benefits of a little bit of negativity being that you have enough data and you know, and I think that it's really hard being blindsided by information. So if you don't know that it's going to be hard, it can feel more like a slap in the face and harder to keep going. In your research, and maybe this is like the research you did for the book or conversations in your clinical practice or even in your coaching practice, what do you think are some of the shared traits or maybe even the shared practices people put into practice to strike a healthy balance between optimism and I'll frame it as realism?
Right. I think that one of the important angles we all want to think about, and we often don't, is to think about the overall situation as a system. Because often we'll enter, let's say, a situation, let's stay with for right now writing a book, hoping to find a publisher for your book, for example. And we tend to personalize the whole thing a lot, which then in part makes us even more vulnerable to thinking it's me, my identity, my whole life, my whole self. And it can connect to some of that, and it's okay to feel these feelings. At the same time, the reality is bringing, in this case, say a book to the world. This is a system. It's a system in which there's you and other authors of many books. There are some publishers, different type of publishers. There is this moment in time when you started writing this book a while ago, not last week, right? And the context of the world has continued to evolve. So now we're in this place, which may be different from when you had your idea and wrote this particular book. So you see how now I'm broadening this perspective to include many aspects of this context. Other people, moment in time, system we're in, country we're in, moment as a society, right? There are many other parts. And as we turn to this kind of larger, again, more realistic, but larger perspective, that often helps us look at more data about the situation. Not only me, MH, submitted a book and now I've received, I don't know, 10 no responses. And therefore I'm the problem, basically. There could be many things that are contributing to this. Maybe there are things that need to change about the book or, some evolution there. I need to be open to this as well. But the reality is that this is a bigger system. It's not just me as an individual in it. And that in itself then allows us to take a bigger perspective, seeing, okay, there's still likely a need for this book to come out. There are right now other variables that are getting in the way or making it not the one thing everyone wants right this second. Okay, we'll continue to learn from this overall process and see where I can take it.
Amazing. So I'm hearing kind of taking those other variables into consideration as a big big one. And it makes me think of two things. One is the chaos theory, and that there is so much that we just is random and we don't have control, and maybe we overestimate how much control we have. And another is an episode I actually did a couple of years ago. I mean, it's like a year and a half ago now, I think, with Elizabeth Fremantle. And she wrote a book that was turned into a movie, Firebrand, with Jude Law. And what was so interesting about her story is that she spent, I think it was like 2 decades writing and submitting and just not just getting rejected. And it was the very first book I think she wrote that ended up turning into that film and becoming like this bestseller, selling hundreds of thousands of copies. And what she said is, she's like, it was timing. Like at the time when her book got picked up, things happened to be happening in the world that made her book relevant at that time period, a fiction book. And I just think it's interesting because I think what was her differentiator is that she stuck with it long enough to have that success, and that most other fiction authors probably gave up many, many years before.
Yes, yes. Well, that's a great story. It is because, yes, we need to take context into account on one hand. On the other hand, we need to persist. And I didn't listen to that particular episode. I did listen to others and love your podcast. What we want to see is in order to have the energy and the health and the comfort to persist in this particular case, she was unlikely going all in, 100%, I'm entirely rejected and worth nothing every single time. There was probably an element of her saying, okay, well, that's another no, and I'll just keep living my life, and we'll continue to carry that torch and see if or when it's going to be picked up. Something like that?
Yeah. So actually she didn't dive into it, but I do believe, and like I have a similar theory, and so I'd love to hear like from your lens of, professional expertise and the research you've done, how that plays in. Because when I think of like careers that are there's just high levels of rejection, like writing a book, especially a fiction book, but also nonfiction. The Squid Games, the screenwriter, apparently he got rejected like thousands of times and took him so many years to get Squid Games to get picked up. And my theory is that these people who went through that many rejections and that grueling process probably had like little dopamine hits coming from other places, and that this wasn't the only thing they were focused on. So like they're not just like, okay, I'm going to spend the next 10 years focused on this one project, and knowing that it's like something that might never get picked up because the odds are just so slim in some industries. They probably had other things. Maybe they were teaching writing courses and having people tell them like that they changed their lives, or like there's purpose and meaning coming from other places along the way while they work on this project that has these very slim odds. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, and I guess what the research says.
Yes. Oh, I love it. So yes, I think that's, and we can learn so much from even this example you're giving, which is a great one, is that if we can, even when we don't know yet if we're going to have like thousands of rejections, but maybe imagine if all of us right this second could decide, I'm going to prepare myself for 1,000 rejections. Okay. So if we think of it, if we knew for sure this is going to happen and nothing terrible is going to happen, but that's just the process. Okay. Well, then we would say exactly this, right? Okay. Well, it's still worth pursuing. So I'm going to keep, trying for this to work. And I will build other things in my life that bring satisfaction, engagement, where I feel like, yes, I'm hearing some yeses over here. And it's great, so that I can carry on. So there is this one piece about broadening our experience, creating a context, right? Again, for ourselves, such that this is not the only thing anymore. This is in part where you'll find sometimes authors being part of writing. So now we're having the social support. We're hearing the experience of many others getting all these no's. You're getting some no's. But again, it now creates a bit of a distance. It's not so personal to just me. It's part of the process. It's very normalizing, right? Now, the other thing too is good old exposure. I mean, if we do 3 rejections, it probably hurts more intensely than if we do 1,000. Less than 1,000. After about 100, we may get to a point where we're like, okay, well, that's another no or another non-response. And we're starting to see the detachment. It's similar to, I don't know, doing a sport or an activity that initially creates anxiety. And what you do is you start small, you build it, and you push yourself a little bit. But at some point, if you've done it 300 times, it probably does not even do a blip because you're like, well, I've done it before. It's fine. Nothing terrible happens. My life goes on. And that's it. So the exposure also is something that helps. Direct one, just for ourselves, and hearing it from other people, which adds to our own indirect, but still exposure.
You're like 100% speaking my language. So, I you touched on so many things. So you touched on like preparing yourself for 1,000 rejections, which may sound absurd, but some of the listeners might know I started with a 100 rejection challenge in writing. So I set up a challenge to get 100 rejections for pitches. And that did exactly what you just touched on, which was exposure and community, because I did it in a community of writers. And so it was something I didn't come up with the idea, someone else came up with the idea, but it got me doing it. And then, like, I think because rejection threatens a very primal part of us, which is that we're going to be rejected from our community. And that's what was crucial to our survival and still is, because I mean, we still require social connection as a huge part of our well-being. So having those two pieces come together was fantastic. And also, you surprisingly get better at what you're trying to do when you keep doing it, because you're getting all those reps in. Just like if you keep going to the gym and show up 1,000 times, you're going to be stronger and your muscles are going to be better. If you keep writing hundreds of pitches and you're tracking it in a spreadsheet and you can see who says yes or who says no or who said maybe, you start seeing, okay, this is what works and this is what doesn't work and this is what I need to do to get better. So yeah, I love that. Another thing that I believe is really crucial to building resilience, and especially with rejection, is having a purpose. So knowing why you're doing it. So if you're setting out for like a 1,000 rejection challenge, you must really, really care about that thing that you're getting rejected 1,000 times for in order to sustain that 1,000 rejection. Now we've just 10x what my rejection challenge was. And I know in your resilience plan, you talk about values, and in the book and the resilience plan. And I think values very much ties to purpose. You know, if you understand your values, you know why you're doing this thing and you can stick with it long enough and be resilient enough to see it through. But values is such a, it's one of those things that I feel like people talk about a lot, but they don't really understand or they don't really practice it. So we can throw the words around. A lot of companies like to set their values and then never look at them again. Or we might even do an exercise with ourselves and set our own values and never think about them again. And I think that the magic really lies in like how often are we revisiting them and how are our values and not just what sounded nice and putting into practice. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit of the importance of values, but also like what are people missing and how can we practice our values better?
Yes. Oh, now you're speaking my language too. Absolutely. Because, and exactly when you were going on purpose, I was exactly going to connect it with our values. So a few things so important here. And it made me think also of a couple of things. I mean, we even have research on happiness and how uh, we're more likely to be happy if we have clarity on our values and bring them to life in a daily and weekly basis in big and small ways. It doesn't need to be always big ways, but even small versions will connect our lives to our values and increase our happiness. So very important. And yes, it could be as simple as, again, I do have a worksheet that will be in the show notes, but to take a moment to write your values. And what I often say to sort of decrease the pressure with, oh, is this a value? Just what's most important for you in life. Okay. So you love gardening. Gardening goes on the list. Is this a value? Well, for the purpose of this, yes, it is. So it goes on the list. And then having that list, trying to generate, I usually say go for at least 10, so we don't stop at 3. If you have more, that's wonderful. And yes, maybe read them on a weekly basis. Get to a point where they're committed to memory, so you know they're here. Because part of what that does, back to the concept of rejection, is that it will ground you. It connects you with what's most important for you. So now we're not in the outside possible validation or not of who you are, your identity, your value, what should happen in your life, you're grounded. This is an opportunity you took, and now it's going in a different directions. Okay, does not change my values here. And that applies to, say, book writer looking for publisher. It also applies for an entrepreneur looking for funding or trying to make something work. That grounding in their own values help. It also is so helpful if, say, you're an employee. Often talk with people about individuals, say, who have been fired and how this comes as an absolute shock. It feels like they've lost their identity, their value, all the things. And sometimes I wish I could just infuse in everyone working for someone the fact that they could be fired anytime. Not in a now turning to extreme pessimistic perspective, but just keeping it on the list of things that could happen, having it on the range. Because again, it's as if we have this positive bias thinking that whatever I'm doing right now, I will keep doing until I decide to stop doing it. Not necessarily the case. It's an employer. Employer will decide whatever is best for the organization, which includes you and I could be let go anytime. And that's just the way it is. Once we include this possibility, which doesn't mean it will happen or anything like this, we just are realistically aware that it could happen, then if it does, we have a bit of a distance from it. We've already pre-normalized it. We will have some feelings, obviously, and it's absolutely okay to live them, feel them intensely, all of this. And other parts of ourselves will be preserved because we thought of this in advance, because we are grounded in our values. I have as much skills as I had last week. It's just that this time, this particular employer decided to do something else. So we cannot underestimate how that clarity on our values is helpful to help us make decisions, help us make choices in our daily and weekly life that align more with it, and keep us grounded in, even our identity, value as a person that we decide, not let outside things going on decide.
Yeah. What you just said there in that last sentence, not let outside things decide for us. What came to mind as you're talking about values is the importance, I think, of having values that are rooted in different parts of our identity. So having values that are not just rooted in our career or not just rooted in family, your partner might leave you or something, and kind of having those different spheres of our lives. And that was kind of what I want to ask you about is I know with rejection, when someone is overinvested in one part of their life, the rejection is far more devastating than if you have different investments. If you have not only your job, but you also have a healthy community and you have a good relationship with your friends and your family, and you also have hobbies, then facing a rejection in one sphere, whether, a friend told you that they don't want to be a friend anymore or you got fired from your job, it obviously will suck, but it will suck less than if you have over prioritized that one thing and kind of neglected other spheres of your life. So the question I want to ask you is when people are looking at values or looking at deciding, I guess, or trying to assess what their values are, can they try and make sure that their values address different spheres of life and not just one part of their life?
That's a great question. I think that a lot of the time, it naturally will happen. In the work I do with individuals, sometimes we will explore more specifically their professional values, because even then, even if we focused only on professional values, there will be many. So it already broadens the perspective that it's not just this one job here. And if this ends, I still have all of these professional values. Now, that being said, often we'll start with just your values in general, what's important for you in life. And that question in itself will tend to bring ideas on the personal, on the relational, on the, so many areas, and professional and other areas of life. So it will tend to do that. And if we're creating our list of values, let's make sure we go as broad as possible, because then, we are complex as humans. There are many aspects of life. So yes, let's make sure you scan all of this around you to decide what goes on your particular list. And back to what you were describing also in a moment ago, I think was very important. This idea of trying to build different areas in your life so that, if, something is just like someone trying, maybe going for 1,000 rejections, but then other things are going on in my life that feed my values in different ways. So that's helpful. The other thing too is that as we do this, not only it diversifies the risk in some ways, but what you're also doing when you're investing in various areas of your life, which in effect is building your resilience, you're literally bringing your buffer higher for everything so that your overall bank, your overall state baseline is increasing, such that if something challenging happens in any of these areas, whether it's a rejection or just a challenge in whatever way, it will make it much easier for us to assess the situation, see how we're going to respond to it, outreach to resources, bringing our community, whatever we need to do for this. Then if the baseline is low, the challenge happens, and often we will feel it much more intensely. And sometimes that's inevitable, but as much as we can proactively build that baseline, and then across different areas, then it builds our resilience in even more sustainable ways.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, it's making me think of supply and demand, what we spoke about earlier. And I know, living in a new country, that they're making friends. Like, I don't share the same community or the same culture with everyone here. And so there's been times where I felt a little bit disconnected, haven't seen or spoken to my friends from home in a long time. Don't feel like my community of friends is as rich as it could be. And I think that it is at those times did my resilience in other areas of life, which is like, okay, you're not kind of getting that support in that sphere. So now you're just a little bit more sensitive to rejection professionally or in
Yes.
something else.
Yes.
And so I can see there, like, the way that kind of balance of prioritizing just different spheres can help with resilience. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Oh, yes, I would. And it is an example, move to a new country that is that different kind of thing is, and I'm saying it this way because, say, here in Canada, I moved many years ago from Quebec to British Columbia. So East Coast to West Coast. You would think it's all Canada, blah, blah, blah. The difference was significant in so many ways. It had, yes, personal impact. It had professional impact. I lost my professional designation because it's different from province to province. It was major. And it is one of those changes that is chronic over time because it's not something that, oh, now I've made a few friends here and therefore it's fine. You know, the depth of some friendship that maybe decades in a different location will maybe take decades here to reach. So no, these demands are there. And what we want to do is, number one, just feel that, because that's just the reality of it. There's no replacement or just, fixing it or something like this. It's there. There is an element of grief even, right? In a situation like this that we want to allow to have space and add other parts to the overall context, those that we have control over, and keep maybe some of those connections in different ways, all the things that I'm sure you're doing in this case. And I think the realization, the realistic perspective on it is in itself so important. Literally have research, neuropsychological research, looking at the difference between saying, I feel isolated and I shouldn't because I've made new friends, or I feel isolated and it makes sense given the big life change that I've done. And it makes sense part is really connects with self-compassion. And we know from research then calms the brain. This fight or flight calms down because now the brain says, okay, she's experiencing this emotion and she's got this. As opposed to she's experiencing this emotion, she's saying she shouldn't, so we stay high alert kind of thing. So that we want to, in any rejection story that we have now, we might have in the future, that element of self-compassion is also something to make sure we bring in.
It's huge. And thank you for raising that. And it makes sense is something that I think is so important. And I think not something we do enough.
That's right. We do it for others, compassion
Yeah.
towards others, but for ourselves. And then, I mean, if nothing else, if sometimes people even hesitate to do it thinking they shouldn't, it will be good for you. But if you need to have another rationale, it will make you better at being compassionate towards other as well. So 2 good reasons to do the self-compassion piece.
Yeah. And I think like another helpful reframe that's helped me, and I've shared it with friends, is to imagine someone younger than you or even a friend if it's not something you can imagine someone younger, but someone that you like really care about. So whether it's like a niece or a child, daughter, or a mentee, and imagine that they're going through the same thing and they're telling you about it. How would you perceive them versus how you're perceiving yourself? That's
Yes.
often quite different.
Yes. Yes. Such a great way to pull us ourselves out of this perspective that sometimes we're spiraling in, right? To make sure we broaden the perspective. If it was someone, close to you, what would you say? And people will respond to this immediately. And then they'll say, oh, I guess I should
Yeah.
think that way for myself too. And yes, I mean, again, easier said than done, isn't it?
Yeah.
But a worthwhile exercise for sure.
The awareness piece helps, becoming aware, it becomes easier to do it. My last question before I kind of ask you to share a little bit about yourself and where people can find you is some listeners, I think, might be feeling a bit confused about where to start in terms of understanding their values and themselves and what they care about. Maybe that's in one of your worksheets. But yeah, tell us, like, if we're just like, I don't know, I care about everything and I don't really know where to start understanding this to put it in practice. Where could they start?
Yes. So if I'll actually step back even more, if the person is completely like, I have no idea where to start, all of this feels too nebulous, all of that, then I would actually start with the exercise on supply and demand. Because that one is very, very concrete. It will not feel nebulous. It will increase your clarity, and it is a good first step. So that may be where I would go first. But then if you're saying, no, I'm good with this, I will do it, and you should, then you go to values. Sometimes, number one, you don't have to do it all in one shot. You could sit down and write a few things, or if nothing comes to mind, that's fine. You've looked at the sheet. And then you let your brain incubate. Incubation is you go do something else, you don't even think about it, but the brain keeps working on it because you've asked yourself the question looking at the sheet, and later something might come to mind, and then you put it down. So you could do that. You could write a few words and come back later. So really incubation in these situations, and your author's audience will relate to this, but sometimes it helps. So something to consider. The other thing is to think of moments where you were particularly happy previously in your life. And often that will connect with things that you enjoyed and that were important for you. And that will probably start you on the kinds of things to put on your values list.
Yeah, yeah. I love kind of letting the thought incubate because that's happened to me so often. Like, you kind of think about something and you're like, I don't know. And then on a walk, it's like, it clicked.
Yes, yes.
Wasn't consciously kind of thinking about it. So yeah, I think like trying to figure something out too hard can often make the brain shut down, but bringing that question to life is often a good start. So for listeners who want to connect with you, read your book and download these resources, I know we'll have it all linked in the show notes, but maybe you can share for anyone who's listening and doesn't have access to the show notes right now, a little bit more about what they can find and where they can go.
Sure. Thank you for asking. So you could go to just theresilienceplan.com, and that site will get you to everything I do, book, everything. So that's one place to go. You could look for the Resilience Plan, the book, anywhere where you buy books, online, local store. We like to support local stores, so maybe try that first. They can order it for you if they don't have it. And otherwise, LinkedIn, always a great place. I'm fairly active there. So if you want to maybe read some of the articles I bring up, that kind of thing, but also add your voice so that if something speaks to you, then you share it with people around you. That way we're nourishing this conversation about all the ways in which we can just, face all these demands that we're all facing and do that together using the research, but also supporting each other.
Amazing. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So the resilienceplan.com and everything else will be in the show notes. So you can find MH on LinkedIn. You can find anything else that we've mentioned here. Obviously the resources we mentioned. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here, Alice.
This was My Rejection Story, hosted by me, Alice Draper.